What is up, everybody? It is Alex from Heavy New York calling from Zoom again, and this time we got Andrew King, the author of Failure Rules, the 5 rules of failure for entrepreneurs, creatives, and authentics. It is so great to have you here. Thank you for being here, man.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me, Alex. Great to
Any
be here.
Anytime, man, anytime. So I didn't get to fully read, the whole book from start to finish, but I did get to read a good portion of it. And this is a really inspiring book. I would say that it's very funny. I would say that it is very truthful, and it almost is kind of like my review of it is like a Loudwire article meets a Hard Times article meets one of those how to for dummies books. So like I think it really has that sort of vibe behind it. Was there sort of like a pinnacle moment after your career working in this industry for so long that made you want to write it and release it now here in 2022?
Well, not necessarily from working in the music industry, although that's always a backdrop, right? So there's kind of this dynamic where, when I worked in the music industry, that was my job, right? So there was passion, but there was also the mechanics of the practicality of running a business or being in an industry. And there is a tendency or susceptibility where you might actually sometimes have a burnout on the music itself because you're in it all the time. I never fully got to that point, but I think I probably flirted with that. But as I kind of left music full time and then did it more kind of in the background as a managed portfolio of IP rights, kind of starting and stopping the labels, releasing 3 or 4 records in a year, and then pausing for a couple of years and just working with those bands and kind of having a little more margin in my time with it. It became much more fun. It was like there was less pressure. It was more about the passion. I could be more choosy with the bands I worked with, more involved, and still had this variety in my life where I was doing other entrepreneurial things, whether it's owning a gym or I'm in banking and finance. I'm an executive fintech banker and doing different things. I wrote a spy novel, and so I think it was really like when I did get inspired for the book, music was still there because, as I say, all stories need soundtracks, even failure stories. That's why I have a companion soundtrack to the book on a playlist on Spotify and Apple Music with all the actual songs for which the lyrics were real like inputs of strength for me during hard times and failures and or inspirational music as I was writing the book. But the idea for the book came on a beach walk when I was going through a business divorce and was about to go through a marital divorce. And I was thinking through, the lessons and wisdom I had gained through different navigating failures throughout the past few decades and different entrepreneurial off-road adventuring. And I was listening to Motorhead. I was listening to the Cro-Mags, right? So music was like always there. It was always the undergirding that kind of like, buoyed me.
Yeah, you're never escaping. You can never escape this industry, no matter how many. Even like I took a break from doing interviews for the first half of the year, and you can't escape it. It's always going to come back for you. There's, I love the term like I didn't choose the industry life. The industry life chose me. Kind of appropriating that for people who haven't explored this book yet. Would you consider this book to be very autobiographical, or is it more kind of like a how-to sort of book in a way, or like a self-help book?
I think it's all the above. It started off autobiographical because that's where kind of the impetus happened. But as I did the first draft, it was really kind of all about my stories. I was like, this is great. This is good for me to get this out, but I need to make it interesting to the reader. Need to make it more applicable, more digestible, more accessible. So that's when I kind of distilled what are the actual applicable lessons. How do I convey that in more of a philosophical way to the reader, and then how can I layer in other case studies from a wide selection of various figures that can give it more texture and more flavor to appeal to both a wider audience as well as specifically appeal to the niches of my interests, whether it be hardcore punk, whether it be the cigar industry, whether it be just the entrepreneurial thought and that type of space. And so I layered in very carefully, case studies that align with that.
So it seems like there was a lot of both looking inward and a lot of looking outward for the making of this as well.
Right. So it's got to start with the inward. The inward then informs how you move forward for the outward. Right. So I think that's a common rhythm throughout each chapter that attaches to each lesson and under each umbrella for each of the rules of failure, each of the 5 rules of failure. So I think you're right. But I think the internal part is kind of the important part that might separate it from most business psychology books. Where a lot of business psychology books, or just business books, not business psychology books, actually focus more on you need to do this, you need to do that, and there's kind of like mindset about tasks versus mindset about yourself, your identity, your being. And I tried to go more into that almost spiritual, soulful side throughout the book because for me, that's where it all starts. I think that there's really kind of a dotted line between entrepreneurs and those that have more of a deeper introspective kind of way of being.
Of course, and there's been a lot of people in the music industry who have been, writing very inspiring, works of literature, whether it would be Brian Slagle of Metal Blade Records, Michael Alago, Johnny Zazula, may he rest in peace, and then, of course, let's not forget so many musicians who have also been expressing this. Were you at all maybe looking at other reference materials too, just to maybe kind of lay down a foundation on how you would approach this wording and the storyline in general?
100%. I mean, I always had a stack of maybe 10 to 15 books where I would snack on them, read a chapter here, a chapter there, just to kind of get the juices flowing and get the input. And so a lot of kind of the anchor quotes above the chapters that maybe set the tone for certain chapters are from other books. I mean, from the music world, Gene Simmons's book, Me Inc., I thought was tremendous and was really cool to read about Gene Simmons's background. And you see him today, and he's kind of, some would say, braggadocious, kind of almost arrogant entrepreneur, like powerhouse. But to think that he literally, his father left him. He's in Israel. It was like after the rebirth of Israel, it was war torn. He had no toilet paper. They were living in absolute poverty. He had to step up and kind of man up and find a way to provide for his mother, and that was really the impetus of that by force, him learning how to be adaptive and entrepreneurial that led to who he is today. And like reading those stories, or John Joseph from the Cro-Mags who wrote The Forward, his book, The PMA Effect. So it's definitely still drew from the music world, but in a broader sense, like the stories behind these figures and some of that grit that maybe led them to be who they are. And I really much related to that and infused that in the book.
Of course, and when it comes to the people who are involved in hardcore as well, you get a very diverse essence of literature there, from John Joseph's book to Alan Robert of Life of Agony making coloring books. Like, do you feel like maybe your hardcore background? Because to me, hardcore is not just a music genre; it is a lifestyle. There's an art form to it visually. There's a whole aesthetic that surrounds something as hardcore. I think of way beyond the music. So, did you have to almost kind of put yourself in the old school New York City hardcore mentality, like think back of the days of working with Madball and whatnot, in order to do this? Were you almost kind of writing the book as if you were a hardcore lyricist in a way? Probably significantly less f bombs in it, but
100%. Even like when I do videos, if you get my YouTube channel at Andrew Thorp King, like before I got psyched up for a video, even though they're like spoken word videos, they're scripted and we planned the scenes and all of that, and there's the professional editing. Like to me, it was like a music video. Like I'm listening to Doc Martin Stomp by Madball before I do it to get pumped up and to kind of get that rhythmic, physical, and mental and verbal energy, right? So like music infuses everything I do. Even I'm a banker by day, right? Buttoned up, can't see the tattoos, that whole thing. If I'm presenting to 100 executives, I'm still listening to hardcore before I go on. I'm listening to Terror or Hatebreed or something, or Warzone, right? Because it gets me in that mood, that energy. And to me, that's just like an energy that just informs my enthusiasm in life, whether it's relationships, whether it's business, whether it's working out, whatever it is. Like music is just this perennial power behind it all.
I am really kind of angry that Marvel hasn't franchised off of the New York City hardcore scene yet with the secret identities. You got Councilman Justin Brennan. Like, I don't see how he's not just he's in his office in City Hall, and then he just rips off the suit and jumps on stage. The singer of All Out War is a history teacher. Like, this is like a franchise waiting to happen. Like I think there needs to be something out there happening like that, like the hardcore superheroes or villains for that matter.
Right, but it's funny how you talk about it. It's the duality, right? Which is a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, right? But for me, like again, like people at my work, a few people I've like given the book to, and someone who used to be an employee of mine, and his wife just thought it was funny that I look like this, or I'm writing like this, or listen to this kind of music because they have this image, right? But the reality is, we've all grown up, right? But that's still in us, that hardcore or punk or metal, whatever it is. For many of us, that never leaves. It becomes this permanent part of our identity, and it informs the way we approach the rest of the things in our life. And for me, kind of, it's both. It's both aggressiveness, enthusiasm, It's just this determination to overcome and adapt no matter what comes your way. And like that's the ethos I've gotten from hardcore. And that has absolutely carried me through from failure to failure into successes.
Of course. And again, we're gonna talk too about making that superhero thing. I think like the superhero, like the Bat Cave for hardcore will be the Niagara Bar in the Lower East Side in a way. The supervillain is some real estate guy who wants to gentrify the whole hardcore neighborhood. We got something going on here. Um, and it's funny you mentioned that too. Like, do you think like the way that you present that the presentation of this book is also going to be very hardcore? Like, could a book reading like this look like the recent Youth of Today show that I just saw in Brooklyn?
Nice. I was at the Youth Today show in Philly, and Raghunath actually gave me a shout out on stage because I sent him a book and he likes the book. And so, yeah, no, I mean, I'm used to putting out records. So that's my mindset. So, this is like very much similar to a record release in the way that I set it up. I mean, the inside artwork was done by Pete McAfee, who does all the artwork for Dropkick Murphys. He's done work for Social Distortion, Hank the Third. He's done work for Black Sabbath. And then I started a clothing line along with the book to echo and amplify the ethos of the book and slogans of the book called Soul and Fire Supply Company. So you can get to that link through my website, andrewthorpking.com. No E on the end of Thorpe, just Thorp. And even like the clothing line, I had Craig Holloway, who used to play in Coldest Life and has done artwork for cover art for, Gnostic Front, Wisdom and Chains, even Nuclear Assault. He did the Soul and Fire smokewear line, which is all cigar oriented designs, but still got this hardcore tattooy kind of feel to it. So the whole aesthetic to me is just this infusion of the hardcore mentality of the tattoo aesthetic. And I mean, even the pinstripe phoenix on the book is, reminiscent of kind of that almost like, the rockabilly, psychobilly type hot rodish kind of feel. And, I work with a lot of psychobilly bands on Sailor's Grave Records, Coffin Cats. I've worked with Mad Sin, Creek Show, Goddamn Gallows, somewhat fits into that genre. Bands like that.
And do you think because like when I told somebody about this book, like, oh, Failure Rules, first they thought it was like a book on the alternative rock band Failure, in a way.
Oh,
Um, but like, do you feel that some maybe people who haven't experienced the New York City hardcore scene and haven't been involved in the music industry and haven't had the experiences that you and I have had, do you think people who may be in other fields could also relate to this book? I'm, reading the Amazon description here, and it mentions everybody from Henry Rollins to J.K. Rowling to Andrew Yang. So,
right. So it's right, and that was the thing that I really had to temper because my instinct would have just been all hardcore references, right? So like, because that's a heavy influence in my life. But I have lots of other influences and lots of other kind of influencers or people that I follow. I mean, James Altucher, the investor, podcaster, serial failure, and comedian. His book Choose Yourself was one of the inspirations for me to even write this book. Srinivas Rao, who wrote The Art of Being Unmistakable, is now I've actually hired him. He's consulting me to help me kind of navigate launching this book. And he was kind of this misfit corporate tech guy that ended up going out on his own and basically writing a book about creativity using surfing analogies and starting his own podcast. So it is a wide array, like you mentioned, Andrew Yang. I mean, I do a chapter on Rodney Dangerfield where I talk about failure humor. Interestingly enough, I mentioned Bill Burr in that chapter. I saw Bill Burr perform in June in Western Pennsylvania. I was there with my son. We go back to the hotel room afterwards. Turns out he's staying at the hotel. We run into him in the lobby. He was talking about wanting a cigar on stage. We ended up hanging out with him out back. At first, he's hanging out with his opening act and his manager. And then like 20 minutes over, he walks over and I'm hanging out having a cigar with Bill Burr. And we're talking about cigars. And I tell him a little bit of the book. And I was telling him about the concept of failure humor. And he's like, oh, yeah, that's exactly what I do. Right. So it's like, there's definitely like I weave in, not these just entertainment, but artists, and, regular entrepreneurs, different stories about those that are just trying to, start their own thing in any way that they can in kind of an unorthodox way.
I love the philosophy of failure because I've heard people in the same breath say, you can't succeed without failing first. But I also heard the same quote: "If you fail to plan, you plan to fail," and that's talking about failure in a much more negative connotation. Do you think that there is like, for lack of better words, the right amount of failure one has to endure, or do you think every situation regarding failure is completely different?
Well, obviously you don't want failure. I mean that's stupid, right? This book is not about failure porn. This isn't, like glorifying failure as something you should just run into and not worry about, not try to avoid. Like you absolutely should try to avoid failure. Failure rule number four is all about a thing one and thing two dependency, to have an enabler pursuit that kind of makes things a little more safe as you go after kind of a wild North Star pursuit. So avoiding failure is something you should do. But if you're pursuing difficult things, and especially if they're things that don't have a blueprint for success, they don't have some sort of existing framework with any sort of certainty, but they call you into the highest spaces of highest meaning, of you actualizing yourself in the world, then you need to go there anyway. And if you're going to go there, you can expect to have more failure than other paths. And if that's the case, you should premeditatively think about how you're going to confront it, how you're going to step back and leverage it, metabolize it, and then optimize it to make the next step in your journey, more full, more informed, and renewed, right? So I think your comment about planning is interesting, because I do address that in the book. I talk about these kind of twin quotes between Peter Thiel, of the PayPal Mafia fame, who wrote Zero to One, where he says, a bad plan is better than no plan. You still have to have a plan, right? And he's kind of countering this idea of iteration, and that's true. But then you got Mike Tyson also saying a plan is great until you're punched in the mouth. So because both Thiel and Tyson are true, are right, you have to have a plan, but you also have to prepare to iterate, right?
Yeah.
Because failures will happen, and you have to learn how to pivot. And pivoting is really just like maintaining the same vision, but shifting your strategy as circumstances change. It's still going towards the same end result.
Yeah, see, to me, like the only like feasible plan one can make is what somebody wants to have for dinner that night, like what I'm eating. But like, with the unexpected, like, okay, my plan is to go to this show and then I'm gonna go here afterward. But you don't know what's gonna happen at that show. My plan is to see this, but you don't know if that's gonna get canceled or not. And if anything we've learned the last couple of years, plans are always up in the air nowadays. So, um,
That's right, right. That's
so
right.
so
So
like,
it's really about like this mindset of like going into it knowing that, sure, you want to deal with anything you can possibly, think of from a contingency standpoint, but it's really going into things just having an expectation that you're going to have to be adaptable in anything in life, and particularly in entrepreneurial paths, particularly in creative pursuits, right? Because you have to kind of go forth without knowing the results, and you're often doing things that are new, that you don't have this kind of like copy and paste, roadmap to apply.
have you ever? Is there a fine line? Because there's some people where you don't know if they're failing at something or if they're just lazy at something. Have you ever been able to make that distinction for some people as well?
No, I mean that's true, right? Because people can just say that, oh, it's just not working, and they're failing, but then maybe they just have a lack of persistency, right? My issue has always been the opposite. I would continue to have sometimes stubborn persistency on a path where it's failed so much, where I probably should have started a new path, right? It's just that raw determination, and I think that's a balance, and that is absolutely circumstance dependent. It's personality dependent. But yeah, I mean, there's no substitute for doing the work, for setting aside the time, and deliberately kind of, trying to invoke the muse, so to speak, and push through, as Stephen Pressfield would call that, resistance, and going after it, doing those difficult things, and just sitting down and sitting in the discomfort of trying to push forward.
Of course, 100%. And you led me perfectly into my final question actually, because pushing forward, I think, is a concept that is the most important concept in hardcore music in general, regardless if it's listening to old school or new school. I've asked every musician in hardcore this question, whether it will be Roger Merritt, or Alan Robert or Mike Scandato, all these different hardcore musicians. What would you say is hardcore?
I'm going to go back, strangely enough, to an Ice Cube quote when NWA got invoked into the, or inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, where he's NWA. It's a rap band. It's not a rock band, but he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he's like, look, rock and roll is a spirit. It's not a style of music. And to me, hardcore is a spirit. It's not a style of music. Sure, we can kind of put these boundaries around what we define hardcore sonically, but really it's that spirit. It is that DIY spirit. It's that individuality. It's that it's that toughness, it's that overcoming. It's kind of the outgrowth of punk, where punk identified the ills and the problems and the dysfunction of the world. Hardcore acknowledged that and said, what are we going to do about it? We are going to overcome. We're going to overpower. This is, hardcore was attempting at higher solutions to the obvious dysfunction and problems that punk pointed out. And to me, that's hardcore. That's the spirit of hardcore.
100%. Because to me, it seems like the concept of hardcore being a sonic description. Like, I've seen Youth of Today finally, and I got to see Sick of It All and all these great bands. But recently, I also saw a band that's a no name in hardcore, 24/7 Spies, and they sound nothing.
Oh yeah, oh they're the best. I remember listening to them when I was in like eighth grade. Oh yeah,
Holy,
24/7 Spot.
I saw them play a show at Tompkins Square Park. It was awesome.
Nice,
Yeah.
nice.
Yep. It just incredible
I
band.
speak to the diversity of the music while still having the unity of the spirit, and that's my point. The spirit is the glue,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
the spirit has certain attributes to it.
Of course, and now with this new age hardcore movement with the Knocked Looses and Code Oranges and Harm's Ways, it almost seems like it's getting even more. The description of hardcore is not really about the sonic as it is more about the unity, and also, of course, watching your ass at the show at pits. I've had to watch my ass in a Sick of It All pit and a Harm's Way pit.
Yeah, right. I mean, think of Turnstile, right? I mean, musically, they're wildly experimental, but they come from the hardcore scene. They come from that spirit. They're still going to go on tour with Madball here. And they're also multi-generational, like you mentioned, Knocked Loose. Like my son's into rap music, doesn't really know hardcore, but when he's watching No Jumper, and he sees Freddie Madball in there, he's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's what my dad's into, right? And there's this connection. He goes to see Suicide Boys, and Knocked Loose is opening up, right? And I think it's that spirit that can kind of still remain hardcore and still have some elasticity with the genres.
Well, rap and hardcore, or even metal in general, seems to really be like uniting. Slipknot just took out Cypress Hill on tour, and then you see a band like Vane touring with Ghostmain. So like I feel
Yeah,
like it's getting more and more united these days.
yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a good thing.
Yep, I think the unity is really applying to everybody outside of the genre as well. But before we go, I want to thank you so much for your time and for such a fun conversation. I just got started on this book. It is absolutely amazing. Definitely a great read for people to check out. Is there just anything else with Failure Rules that you would like to plug? Could we be expecting any readings, live readings anytime soon? And where, of course, could people get it? Amazon is one, but where else could we be getting this?
Yeah, working on some live stuff for next year. No news to report on that yet. Right now, just doing podcast tour. But they can go to andrewthorpking.com. No E on the end of Thorpe. There you'll find a free Failure Rules mini course you can sign up for, and then you'll be on the email list, and you'll get kind of weekly unique content of failure wisdom. There's also a link to the merch store for Soul and Fire Supply Company. Kick-ass designs there. You can get a link to the soundtrack, link to the YouTube channel, and follow me on Instagram at Andrew Thorp King. No E on the end of Thorpe.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, everybody. We are here with Andrew Thorp King, no E at the end of Thorpe. Be sure to check out the book, Failure Rules, the 5 Rules of Failure for Entrepreneurs, Creatives, and, of course, Authentics. This is Alex from Heavy New York. We will see you next time.